Hello, my name is Mauricio Baros. I'm going to present my work, La Chimba's Urban Heterotopia, Architectural Literature in Santiago de Chile. La Chimba is one of the oldest neighborhoods in Santiago de Chile, etymologically meaning on the other side of the river. A place that has been condemned since the Spanish conquest. Since its beginning, it was destined to house everything that wasn't considered civilized, that it was used as a place for the indigenous population, and it was also considered a place of unrest and lawlessness. Since then, this neighborhood started to house all those activities that were not regarded in accordance with a newly enlightened society. For example, cemeteries, asylums, madhouses, lazarettes, casual market, and secluded religious places such as nunneries and convents. More recently, this has been the preferred location of a so-called red light district, as well as being a preferential neighborhood for immigrants. Many of the programs constitute what Foucault defines as heterotopias, and many of them have remained as such for centuries. This neighborhood has turned into a sort of a fertile imaginary that has nourished Chilean literature and cinema in recent times. Precisely for one of his literary products that we would like to examine La Chimba, which is José Donoso, the observer of the night. The hypothesis would be that this book is a summary of this suburb, since the chronotopical spaces shown by Donoso are no more than a mirror of what exists in the area itself. Moreover, the personages who inhabit this fictional space are simply a representation of the uses who regularly visit it, and inhabit the hospital, psychiatric enclosure, bathhouse, and brothel of La Chimba. The architectural cultural value of this neighborhood lies in the fact of being a place which has defied modernity, appearing itself as a kind of counter-modernity corresponding to a pre-capitalist urban order, a space that are now extinct in most of our cities, and which somehow need to be preserved because they form part of the very identity of them. They say that the devil liked La Chimba so much that he almost cried with pleasure when he saw himself in it, says Nora Fernandez in her book Mapocho. La Chimba seemed to have been born under an ominous fate, since most of the colonial cartography tend to orient the map toward the mountain range, thus leaving this district on the sinister side of our cartography. Several readings seem to arise from this complete book and uncharted quarter of Santiago de Chile. La Chimba, at times it appeared to us as a mute, enclosed, and opaque area for our gaze. At others, it revealed itself as an alluring, festive, and colorful neighborhood. The reason for this dichotomy apparently lies in what has been the history of this quarter, and also in the rich imaginary we have built of it. Thus, to address the subject, we must look at it from two perspectives: the historical reality and the imaginary that goes with it. To this end, we will resort to two disciplines that usually meet and complement each other, which are literature and architecture. In José Donoso's aforementioned work, the main space in which the action takes place is the house of La Rinconada, an old convent located in La Chimba. One of the most common chronotopes in Donoso's work is the house, coronation, the sundial, the observer of the night, a house in the country, and other works all take place in houses. The house has been a frequent topic in many writers, which is the reason we will use the concept of house of fiction called by Henry James, because it alludes to both physical and literary space. The same term is used by Flora González Mandry in her work The Donoso House of Fiction, which constitutes one of the best analyses of author work. Here, the author hypothesizes that the house in Donoso's work became a space of representation, a stage, on which the characters perform, and thus they become a theater. It is precisely this concept of representation where both Donoso's work and La Chimba neighborhood seem to converge. La Chimba has usually been considered through the prism of stigmatization, to which it was condemned from its origin, giving rise to the vision of a punished city, La Ciudad Potrero, the patchwork city of Vicuña Maquena, or the Variant city by Faustino Sarmiento, as the part of the city occupied by the indigenous population. Consequently, the destiny of La Chimba was to mass a place of absences: the absence of urbanity, the rural spaces, the absence of health, the hospital, the absence of sanity, the psychiatric, the absence of life, the cemeteries. In this way, La Chimba has become the depository of everything that we don't want to see and that was destined for that place on the other side of the river. These absences, however, become presences because they somehow have to be contained and housed in an ad hoc architecture, which is why these urban heterotopias began to emerge at an early stage. and began to populate its territory. Thus, as early as the colonial period, the convents appear. Recoleta Dominica, Monasterio Camber bajo San Rafael, Colección Franciscana, Congregación de Buen Pastor. Subsequently, in the Republican area, the hospital enclosure appeared. Lazareto de San Vicente de Paul, Lazareto del Salvador, the Fair State Asylum, Casa Dorates, the public cemetery, and the Catholic cemetery. All of them conveniently distant from the urban center. Around the northern edge of the river, the food depots known as La Vega Central were later installed. All these buildings covered ample territory of La Chimba, each of them adopting a clear heterotopic physiognomy, and undoubtedly allow us to visualize this quarter as a great urban heterotopia. These absences appear to be more evident by the resources used to conceal them. High walls, enclosure completely opaque to the passerby, which sometimes extend over an entire block, even closing off a street, as was the case of the convents. These absences have not only been hidden, but also accumulate over centuries. For example, the public cemetery houses more than 2 million deceased. They seem to achieve a hyper-presence that sometimes seems grotesque to us. Hence the permanent necessity to elude it and hide it. This is why for many centuries the Mapocho River that separates the center of La Chimba was considered to be the stick of our city. Carlos Franz talked to us about the tendency in the urban novel to show the city as a theater of horror, an annus mundi, and an image. In this sentence, the author seems to summarize clearly two features that are attributed to La Chimba, especially in the literary field, which is to be a package space and the back of the city. This neighborhood has been condemned to be the urban ass of our city. Since everything what we discard is there, it is also a refugee of a rich imaginary associated with the grotesque. La Chimba was a place of backwardness, opposed to the progress of the urban center. This became more evident with the advent of the Republic and the subsequent growth of the city through the 20th century. This area seemed to have stagnated, languishing into a limbo out of which it only recently seemed to have been released. This is undoubtedly exacerbated by the heterotopic condition of a large part of this territory. Heterotopias undoubtedly constitute the cloakroom of modernity as anti-modern spaces. Thus, whereas the rest of the city was being transformed, La Chimba remained in a rural lethargy, from which it seemed to have no intention of emerging. Urban heterotopias are opposed to the capitalist city paradism, since most of them are non-productive spaces. Cemeteries, convents, and asylum, places that appears to be at standstill. These are precisely the people who inhabit these places, the one who constitute Donoso's main character in his work. Old women, disfigured people, the insane, the sick, etc., make up the spectrum of La Rinconada residents. For them that Donoso built this literary heterotopia that is the house of La Rinconada, in order to house all his monstrosities, contracted both from true reference and based on his own traumas, fears, and anxieties. Donoso's work are haunted by decadence and decrepitude, as is evident in most of the main characters in his work, who are destined to remain hidden and locked up. Such a vision of an apocalyptic decrepitude combined with an infernal and labyrinthine spatiality is, according to Nature, typical of a schizophrenic mentality. Second figure alluded by Carlos Franz is the image. The image is none other than this mythical being from the south of our country, which appear as the main metaphor for enclosure, which here we understand as the enclosure is constantly alluded by Donoso through his work. In addition to the physical and above all symbolic confinement under which La Chimba has remained for centuries, according to Adriana Valdez, the image is a sign of a hidden power that is deeply present in Chilean culture, a mode of existence, which has been a true force and leitmotif for the construction of the literary and cinematographic imaginary of recent decades in our country. The image is a remnant of the rural colonial Chile that was perpetuated in the national identity for centuries, representing a feudal world. It is therefore a figure that symbolizes confinement, but not any confinement, but rather a closure that is the result of eternal covering, weaving, enveloping, culminated in the paralysis of the individual, expressed metaphorically through the solipsism related to the madness and the asphyxiating expansion that the house undergone. A situation that in the urban space become translated into the metaphor of the cloister, because what was undoubtedly present in La Chimba were the cloister. Due to the religious vows, the woman convent were the most heterotopic within the urban fabric of La Chimba, which, with their forced seclusion, remained for centuries with a gloomy presence. Against the urban disorder of the city, and behind closed walls, this orchard and garden, characteristics of convent space, were cultivated. Indeed, it's precisely based on this figure that Donoso built his house of La Rinconada, that here, the religious Arcadia is distorted into decadence. This mirror place, where the paradisiacal is transformed into something infernal, becomes a literary device through which Donoso introduced the grotesque into the story. Through the grotesque, a different nature is introduced, as Kaiser asserts. A new reality is inserted, a device that enables literature to evade closure. The grotesque is in this way, can also be considered as an escape from the author himself, from his text, and from his reality, an escapism which is also a hiding place, which is embodied in the physical space in a device usually widely used by literature and architecture, which is the labyrinth. The labyrinth emerged as a central topic in Donoso's work. Writers such as Borges, Cortázar, Saramago, and others have made the labyrinth a chronotope. As for our author, it is a figure that adopts two phases, one as a literary structure and other as a mental structure. The mental labyrinth is but a refugee from the Cartesian space of the urban grid. This urban grid so distinctive of the centers of the Spanish American cities, which arose as the imposition of the enlightened and civilized European thought to tame the invincibility of the indigenous landscape. Confront to this, any Chimba or indigenous space is nothing but a refugee from this informed rationality. The straight street of the orthogonal city doesn't allow memories to be housed in them. Everything seems to escape and flow. Everything is exposed. The orthogonal city is not a city of corners, as Bachelet would tell us. Indeed, it is the literary space that can build the false and minder on this asphyxiated homogeneity to make it livable. Somehow, this is what Donoso does when he creates the House of La Rinconada, as a labyrinth of multiple dimensions, mental, psychic, symbolic, and physical. Donoso's generation has been described as a generation of urban writers, where the rural leitmotif has disappeared to become a topic associated with backwardness, culture, savagery, and grotesqueness. And this is manifest by the constant reference to the countryside that the author constantly referred by the presence of animals such as stray dogs and the habitat manner of many of his characters who came from the rural world. The constant reference to the heavy mud walls of these houses, an indigenous material associated with poverty and backwardness, and one that, despite the damage caused by the great earthquake, seemed to determine to remain in our urban landscape. A material that is also linked to the idea of closure and the phenomenon of the confinement, of the imbanch, since the walls seem to immobilize both his character and himself. Most of these walls, which are still present in La Chimba, are indeed the byproduct of his heterotopic spaces of concealment and are a common recurring literary topic. As conclusion, Santiago was born under the sign and stigma of exclusion. The Spanish conquerors were looking for a medieval Arcadia and they found barbarism. Their attempt to eradicate savagery only ended up creating a second barbarous America, which, whether varied, hidden, concealed, persisted through the centuries and end up becoming completely fully present through the periphery. This periphery, which is a palimpsestic and rhizomatic ensemble, infuses surreal experience to his passerby and his inhabitants on the margins of the city. This was a subject much exploited by urban literature. The history of Latin American literature has been nothing but the transit between this barbarism, initially wild, and later becoming urban. The pampas, the jungle, the desert were replaced as topic by the slum, the shantytowns, the callampas, whatever the American urban periphery is called. The Latin American urban center failed in most cases to produce a literature like the European counterpart. For this reason, the absence of a style that can be accused gives rise to a fair style, proper to that which doesn't seem to have one. The idea of a fair style seems to have a lot of sense nowadays. Although for centuries the dichotomy between a barbarian city and a proper city was suggested regarding La Chimba, this division no longer seems to make sense when the whole of Santiago has become a Chimba. From this point of view, it would be more appropriate to consider La Chimba today as a liminal space, as this quarter was no longer a frontier or limit, but rather a door, a threshold to everything that has historically remained barred or hidden, and which in today's society of transparency is impossible to hide. In the contemporary world of globalization and the promiscuity of network, the multiracial and hybridity have ceased to be marginal and now occupy a central place. For this reason, the theory of a shared space of baba, soya, etc. becomes a more appropriate answer to the current urban situation of La Chimba. The abstraction of the Hispanic urban grid, the denial of the indigenous city, and the exclusion of its native inhabitants, and the subsequent instant of refusal and concealment only contribute to the construction of a structural emptiness that has settled in our consciousness, and thus populate our history with utopias which have become heterotopias and dystopias, fully of incomplete and unfinished projects. Hence the importance of this shared space, that of literature, which in some way intend to mend, to patch up, reassemble the unfinished and battered landscape of our cities. This is the role of Donoso Imbanch, the fictitious construction of a device woven from scraps, affective, psychic, but also physical and urban, which attempt to recompose either a personal or social history, or a landscape, trying to give closure and completion to whatever has not been to be able to do so, thereby the strong necessity of closure, both for the image and of the literary space. Through his work, Donoso not only worked with the topic of the house in almost all his work, but also his entire work could be understood as the construction of a great house, of his own fictional house. This is nothing but a mirror on the history of La Chimba, built through infinite heterotopias, which end up turning it up into a great urban heterotopia, which after centuries now seem to have opened up to the world.